This game is absolutely mental. It was played in round 2 of the Superbet Chess Classic. It's Alireza Firouzja with white, Jan Nepomniachtchi with black. Let's see what happened here. So Alireza kicked off with pawn to e4. We had e5 from Jan. Alireza went for this bishop's game with bishop c4, also known as the Italian game. Knight to f6, pawn d3. And now very often you see knight c6, bishop c5, that kind of setup. But Jan goes pawn c6 here. He goes a different way, looking to set up the big centre. So knight f3 from Alireza, pawn d5, hit that bishop. And you don't really want to be taking here too prematurely. You give black that big centre. Then when the pawn recaptures, the knight can come to c6 immediately. So Alireza just drops back here, bishop b3. And now Jan goes pawn a5. He's threatening pawn a4 here, trapping the bishop. So there's no time to take on e5. White has to respond. So pawn a4 was played. And now equally black can't take this pawn here, start trying to pawn grab, go a pawn up, because white takes on e5. Look at that f7 weakness. This is awful for black. So Jan didn't do this. He flicked in this bishop b4 check. And now the whole idea of this is you want to make it difficult for this b1 knight to develop. So if you block with bishop d2, that is possible, but then you're trading pieces. It's not so much of an advantage for white. So pawn c3 was played by Alireza. This is the main way to play. You kick back the bishop, and then black's arguing, okay, your knight can't come to c3 anymore. That's why I've lost the tempo. So the bishop now defends this pawn here. We had takes on d5 now from Alireza, and so he didn't have to play like this, but when he resolves this tension in the centre, although he gives black the big centre, allows the knight to come to c6 potentially, what he's got in compensation now is pressure on that d5 pawn. He brings out this bishop, although I have to say I do feel that black's done quite well in this opening battle really. You've got the two central pawns, your pieces don't have too many development issues, so I wouldn't say this is the greatest opening for white here, and the computer already slightly prefers black in this position. So bishop e6 was played, holding that d5 pawn. The knight now came to a3, looking at this b5 square. And now the black knight didn't come to c6, instead it landed on d7 here, just looking to hold its brother on f6, also support e5, and this frees up the queen in future to move away from that pin. So knight b5 was played, hits the bishop, it dropped back into b8, and now Alireza strikes at the centre, again not forced, but he wants to start undermining that central control. Black kicked on with pawn e4, and now knight d2 was played, and after castles, the most usual way for white to play here is with an immediate castles, but Alireza went knight to f1, immediately looking to land the knight on that powerful e3 square, where it blockades the pawn, also looks at these light squares. So pawn h6 from Jan, he kicks that bishop back, it dropped to h4 here, and now Jan wants to start developing some of these heavy pieces. They're stuck on the back rank here. So where does the queen actually go? Well, he plays bishop f4 here. Might look slightly strange, but you activate it outside. You allow the queen to then come to b8 in many lines. And you can't really be kicking this bishop with pawn g3. You know, your own bishop's on h4 here. So it's actually fine on that square. And now best from Alireza was actually just knight to e3 here, bringing that to the blockading square. Black never really wants to give up this bishop for knight. That wouldn't be the best strategic decision. But what Alireza does here is pawn to h3. Not such a bad move in itself. But after Jan goes rook to e8 here, he doesn't play queen b8 or g5 or any of that stuff. He just brings a rook to the e-file, sees what Alireza will do. Here's where Alireza goes full Alireza mode, just an awesome move. He goes pawn g3, drops this bishop back to b8, and then pawn g4. Now, I'm not saying this is a great way to play, because it's not. You give this whole on f4, it's a bit over-ambitious. Black's just clearly better here, but it's absolute classic Alireza, just pushing this g-pawn, playing aggressively. That's why we love watching his games. So he's gained some space, he's kicked that bishop out of there, but knight f8 is an excellent move from Jan. He's looking to come to g6, then into f4. There's some positional problems here for Alireza. So he goes knight e3. He's now got pressure on d5, of course, but Jan gets knight g6. The bishop is attacked, and the best way to play here is simply to drop back, recognise the issues of this f4 square, and if black lands the knight here, coming into d3, setting up the octopus, you have to exchange that one. The bishop recaptured, but I do understand why Alireza didn't do this. He would have seen this. It's the top line of the engines, but then you're doomed to a miserable position for the rest of the game with that strong dark squared bishop. So Alireza didn't do this one. Instead, he actually just chopped on f6. He gave black the dark squared bishop, but this was his idea. So now he takes on d5 here. At least he picks up a pawn, considering he's now positionally worse. And already black could have jumped in here with knight to f4, coming into d3 with check, even if you give this b7 pawn. That was actually the most ambitious and accurate way to play. But instead, Jan just took here. He thought, okay, I'm still better. I'll just take that bishop on d5. After the knight jumps in, stick my queen on g5. I've still got great dark squared control. The white king hasn't castled. My rook is opposite it. e3 could be coming at the right moment. So this is still really dangerous, and Jan's judgment was correct. So Alireza has to take some defensive measures. He could go knight e3. Instead, he goes pawn c4, so he wants to lift the rook in some variations, defend across the third rank. And now this knight should really just jump into f4 here. This is the best move. Again, if white wants to swap, will you just pick up this monster grip on the dark squares? This is good for black. But what Jan did here was go bishop f4. And suddenly, in the space of just that one move, the bar swings. White is actually better here. Alireza's got what he wanted, a mess on the board. This is now anyone's game. So the best move here is queen e2. You basically want to take some defensive measures around your king and start freeing up some space for it to run away. But what Alireza did was queen to b3, not quite so accurate, but then Jan also makes an inaccurate move back. So he should bring his rook to the centre of the board, just keep bringing pieces. But instead he goes pawn h5, he starts playing against his king there, but now Alireza can start taking an initiative. He goes knight back to e3, holding g4. Jan comes into h4 here. There's a pin against the rook. So Alireza captures here. The queen recaptures, but now queen d1, threatening to exchange queens. Let's not forget white's a pawn up, so black can't afford that. So the queen dropped back. Again, you could go queen e2. That's what the engines want. But knight f5 from Alireza. He loves to go on the attack. The queen moved to h7 here, and now queen g4. This was his point. He wanted queen g4 in one move, not queen e2 and then g4. And now there's some attacking ideas for Alireza. g7's coming under fire. The pawn could be moving up the board on the h-file. Maybe rook g1 someday. So rook a6 was played by Jan. He takes some defensive measures. And now best here for Alireza was actually pushing this h-pawn, but he decides to now run with his king. He does want to take some defensive measures. The rook came to f6 now, and Jan's just had a moment to bring some pieces to the defense. h4, h5 isn't quite as strong now, especially with this queen pinning that pawn to the rook. So Alireza moves the rook. Best was coming to the g-file here, then you keep pressure on g7. Alireza came to the e-file instead. Also looks logical, anticipating e3, but now Jan gets to drop the knight back. He can move that one away, g7's not caving in, plus the knight on f5 is now attacked by two pieces, so it dropped back into e3 here, and now Jan dropped his bishop back all the way to b8, opens up the rook, attacking the f-pawn, and so Alireza has to drop back and defend. Now you could come back and defend on g2, Alireza comes to e2. I mean, this game is so tactical, it's very hard to criticise. We're coming up to time control as well. So here after queen e2, now Jan could actually win a pawn on h3. But the reason he doesn't do this is now white gets king c2. Classic Alireza counterattack. He's now looking to bring a rook to h1. This is better for white. So instead, Jan goes queen to h4. He just sits on that pawn, pressures f2 some more, and now Alireza has to go passive. Rook f1 holds that pawn, but rook f3 from Jan. Excellent move, sitting on the position. There's pressure against h3. Not easy for white to play. So the king came to c2, connecting the rooks, running away. Now the knight came into e6. It's looking to come into that f4 square, so knight d5 was played, covers that square, and now best for Jan was picking up that h3 pawn with his rook, but he carries on his knight excursion, brings it into g5, also looks very menacing, looks at this f3 square if the rook ever moves. So Alireza brings another rook to the centre. He wants to bring more defensive measures around his king. The rook came to e6 here, again looking to join the attack via f6, and Alireza now lets that move occur. He drops his knight back to c3. He's looking at his own ideas of pushing the d-pawn here. And now Jan went rook to f6 here, and you could have actually come back, because black doesn't have time to take here. White takes on f6 with check. The other move you could play here is king to b1, but what Alireza does here is actually go a bit passive. He plays knight d1 defending that pawn. Now it did look critical, but it wasn't the best way to play, and now Jan's just clearly better. Lots of problems now with these weak kingside pawns, and now once again you could take on h3 with the rook. Instead, Jan decides to drop back here. He clears the f3 square for his knight, because he's noted that he's actually winning in exchange here by force. That rook's entombed. So Alireza goes queen e3. He comes away from any skewer stuff with his king. And now knight f3 was played, hits this rook, and you can't save it with rook e2, because then the queen takes here. You're hitting this one. It's got no squares, or else the knight takes it. So that's no good. Alireza lets his rook be taken, but he plays pawn d5. He starts trying to generate his own counterplay with those pawns. So Jan now went bishop e5. He uses the weakness of the last move. There's no need to rush and pick up the exchange. But c5 from Alireza, he's looking to get those ones going through. Now the knight took on e1. The rook recaptured, and here Jan cashes in. He crashes 2 on f2 with check. The knight recaptured here, and now Jan didn't immediately recapture. He could have done this, but then after rook e2, it's not entirely clear what's going on. Say you capture that one, that's the best move. The queen recaptures. Queen f4 does leave black with advantage, but after pawn d6, it's not entirely clear what's going on. So instead of actually taking on f2 immediately, Jan played this rook f3 move. A nice intermezzo, putting a very tough question for white. Now technically best is actually taking here with the queen, but the problem with this is that you have to see that after rook f2 check, you hide your king on d1. Now if you go anywhere else, you're running into really horrible checks, because you've got the bishop and the rook converging on this b2 pawn. If you step up to the third rank, then there's queen takes on h3 with check. So that's why king d1 has to be played, but then black has this check. Okay, you can block with rook e2. The whole thing gets crazy. It's technically the best way to play, but so unhuman to see that you can do this and not get mated or lose tons of material. So instead of going for this one, Alireza didn't take on e4 with the queen. He took with his knight here, and it's a good practical try, because although you give the rook up here, after rook recaptures, we can see that d-pawn is very dangerous. So Nepo played pawn f5. He dislodges that knight. It hopped back into c3 here. Now the rook is attacking the bishop. You don't have time to keep that one and play too leisurely with bishop f6. So Nepo captured here. He keeps an initiative going. The knight recaptured, and now queen f2 check was played. And the challenge here is that if you block with rook e2, well then you're dropping your c5 pawn. So king d3 was played, holds the rook like that, but now pawn f4. Kicks that rook away once again. It came into e4 here, attacking the f-pawn, and now Nepo correctly assesses you don't capture the c5 pawn, because then you lose on f4, and now this is really unclear. Black's lost that passed f-pawn. This is a passed pawn, anyone's game. So instead of doing that one, he went queen g3 check. An excellent move because you kick the king away and then you get the f-pawn running. Now the best move here, as I was showing, is king to c2. And basically it's because after king to d2, now you're running into actually checks when this pawn promotes in many of the lines. So after pawn f3, pawn d6, now black gets king g2, and Alireza is just in all sorts of trouble. Say you go, for example, king to e3, well now pawn f2, if you go pawn d7, well now we're making a knight, this is also check. Say king d4, you could also go to f4, but wherever you go, we're then picking up this pawn at the end of the line. So this is the basic problem with putting that king back on d2. It was more accurate on c2, then it's not running into the checks, but even then black was still better. So in this position after check, Alireza went knight to e2, but this is just a desperado, asking black to take, then you'll recapture with the rook. Nepo went pawn f2, of course, threatening to queen. We had a couple checks here, the king came up, and after king f6, Alireza resigned. So he goes down in this one, but fair play to him going h3, g3, g4, really aggressive stuff, mixing it up. That's why he's so fun to watch. If you want to see another amazing game between these two players, then click here. Thanks for watching, see you soon.